Under threats of obliteration, London would enforce a mandatory blackout in the midst of wartime chaos. Permitted the use of limited light sources to navigate the night during the Blitz, this mandatory blackout not only left the populace operating in near darkness, but vulnerable to the hands of a savage attacker. February 1942. For 6 days, the people in northern London were not just living in the horrors of war, but had to look over their shoulders in fear of a monstrous man. Gordon Cummins was a member of the Royal Air Force who was 28 years old at the time and stationed in London. Cummins claimed 4 lives and mutilated 3 of his victims in sexually grisly ways during his atrocious spree. His first attack was on Evelyn Hamilton on February 9, 1942. The pharmacist's body was found in an air raid shelter in Montague Place, London, with reportedly 80 pounds missing from her purse. Hamilton had been murdered by strangulation with no evidence of sexual assault. The following day, he attacked another woman who was also named Evelyn Oatley, whose unfortunate encounter with Cummins would sadly lead to her death. Oatley had been strangled and her throat had been slit. Her body was found naked in her apartment and crudely sexually mutilated with a can opener. Authorities were able to determine that the killer was left-handed based on the evidence found at the scene. This was the first of a few major clues in identifying the perpetrator. The third consecutive victim was not discovered until 3 days after her murder, which occurred on February 11th on Gosfield Street, Marylebone. Margaret Florence Lowe had also been strangled and was found in her apartment. Her body was lacerated with various tools and had been violated with a candlestick. Another chance meeting with the insidious murderer that would turn deadly was Doris Joannet, a married woman whose body was discovered in her home. Like previous victims, she was also naked, sexually mutilated, and with displayed signs of strangulation. The mutilation of the victims were compared to that of Jack the Ripper, which led newspapers to classify this killer as a Jack the Ripper type, giving him the moniker the Blackout Ripper. On February 14th, Greta Hayward would have her own brush with the killer on the loose. She was attacked by a man wearing a Royal Air Force uniform at Piccadilly Circus. However, Hayward was luckily spared after a delivery boy making his rounds that evening interrupted the Blackout Ripper, who quickly fled the scene. Leaving in a frenzy, the killer left behind another vital piece of evidence in the form of a gas mask issued by the Royal Air Force, which contained a service number 525897 etched on the inside. Unable to satisfy his wicked urge, the Blackout Ripper immediately sought out another victim. Catherine Mulcahy would be the unlucky target whose path would cross with the determined sadistic serial killer. He offered her 2 to 5 pounds to entertain him back at her apartment, to which she agreed. After arriving at her place, the killer made an attempt to strangle Mulcahy, but to no avail. She fought back by kicking him, which, once again, sent him rushing away from the scene, leaving behind yet another clue to his identity: a uniformed belt. With a fingerprint from the can opener, a registered Royal Air Force gas mask, and a uniformed belt, all of these items combined led to the arrest of Gordon Frederick Cummins, who was arrested on February 16, 1942. With the evidence stacked greatly against him, Cummins was tried and sentenced to death by hanging. He was executed in Wandsworth Prison on June 15, 1942, during an air raid.
Somewhere near here lives the killer they call the Yorkshire Ripper.
The murder victim was identified tonight as 20-year-old Jacqueline Hill, a student who...
Plans are in hand to virtually seal off the city.
Relatives have been told it would not be appropriate to address the court when the hearing on the Yorkshire Ripper's tariff takes place.
Before he claimed the life of his first victim, the Yorkshire Ripper attacked 2 other women, both of which were attempted murders that authorities would later link to the ferocious killer. Due to the nature of his crimes, this killer's spree is often compared to the infamous Victorian slayer Jack the Ripper, and whether his violent acts were directly inspired by the notorious murderer or not, the moniker he was given certainly derived from the similarities. Between October 1975 to November 1980, the Yorkshire Ripper's reign of terror befell northern England within the 5-year span. According to the BBC, the attempt to apprehend the killer was one of the country's largest manhunts, consuming 2.5 million hours. Like his quote-unquote predecessor, His victims displayed subsequent injuries in the form of mutilation after either having been struck and beaten to death by a hammer or attacked from behind by a knife. Their bodies displayed wounds such as slits and tears on the flesh. 13 women's lives were tragically taken and 7 others collided with the killer and escaped. The victims and their families were left with the trauma of the barbaric spree. With a ruthless attacker roaming the streets, West Yorkshire authorities investigated and interviewed thousands of men in hopes of finding their killer. Among the thousands was Peter Sutcliffe, a truck driver who was interviewed by police 9 times and somehow managed to walk free after each questioning. At the time, police were overwhelmed with information and were unable to properly cross-examine main pieces of evidence against Sutcliffe. They even once showed him a photograph of the suspect's boot print from one of the crime scenes, without so much as noticing that Sutcliffe himself was wearing that very piece of evidence during the interview with authorities. A crucial oversight that would allow the Yorkshire Ripper to continue his brutal spree. On January 2, 1981, Sutcliffe was found in his vehicle, which had a fake license plate, while in the company of a sex worker. He was apprehended and taken into custody, where he ultimately confessed to the murders. Sutcliffe's murderous rampage had finally come to an end. He was convicted on 13 counts of murder, 7 cases of attempted murder, and was sentenced to 20 life terms on May 22, 1981. After his conviction, he spent time in a psychiatric ward in Berkshire and was later transferred back to prison once he was deemed stable enough to serve time in prison. In November of 2020, the notorious serial killer would meet his demise as a direct result of the current global pandemic. Peter Sutcliffe refused treatment after contracting coronavirus behind bars. He died of COVID at the age of 74. In late 2007, within a 2-month period, a man who was no stranger to criminal activities and assaults would be dubbed as a Jack the Ripper copycat. Derek Brown wasn't just a regular patron of sex workers, but he was also a sex offender, among other convictions, who'd been convicted of rape in 1989 and was sentenced to prison for 7 years. Furthermore, police believed he had raped at least 6 women and sexually assaulted another half a dozen.
They met here in Whitechapel, where Jack the Ripper had killed more than 100 years ago. Now Derek Brown was himself set on becoming a serial killer, finding his victims in this same area.
Brown is considered by authorities as a copycat due to the fact that he met his victims in London's East End in the Whitechapel area, where the notorious 1800s slaughtering assailant Jack the Ripper stalked and murdered his victims. They believed he was attempting to imitate the Ripper killings. His first victim was a 29-year-old DVD seller named Xiao Mei Guo, an immigrant from China who was a wife and mother of 2. Selling counterfeit DVDs was her way of making a living, and would unfortunately be the thing that brought her face to face with a cold-blooded killer. On August 29, 2007, Brown offered to make a large purchase of DVDs from Guo, as long as the DVDs were working, and proposed that she come back to his apartment so he could test them out. Likely eager for a big payday, Guo agreed, and the pair were spotted boarding a train, leaving Whitechapel and headed to Rotherhithe, where Brown was residing at the time. After the unassuming Guo was lured to Brown's apartment, she would never be seen again. A few weeks later, Brown targeted his next victim. Bonnie Barrett crossed paths with Brown less than half a mile from where Guo sold her counterfeit DVDs. Barrett worked at a known red light district in Whitechapel, where she was approached by Brown, whom she was seen leaving with. It's believed that Brown had used the services of sex workers in that area and was known to Bonnie Barrett. After leaving with Brown, she too was never seen again. Detectives uncovered a CCTV footage showing Guo with an unidentified man on the morning of August 29th. With this piece of evidence, detectives questioned the people in the area, receiving a bullseye tip from a convenience store clerk who knew exactly the whereabouts of Brown, pointing in a direction saying, "He's standing over there." Brown was apprehended on the 8th of October 2007 for the murder of Xiao Mei Guo, and as the investigation unfolded, authorities would discover Brown's attempt to clean up the crime scene he'd created through carpet and wall modifications and fresh paint. Despite his efforts to hide the evidence, traces of blood were visible in various parts of his apartment, where DNA matching to Guo and Barrett was found. They also found receipts in his apartment from a DIY store for the purchase of paint, heavy-duty gloves, cleaning materials, rubble sacks, and a bow saw. Brown pleaded not guilty, and during his trial, he claimed to have had sex with each of the women on a number of occasions, but had not killed them. He further claimed that he last saw them in his apartment where both women were supposedly accompanied by 2 other men. He described the men with Gua as mean-looking Chinese men who supposedly beat her up as she left his apartment, and the 2 with Barrett as crack-smoking bikers with whom he and Barrett were supposedly hanging out with before they asked him to make himself scarce so they could have sex with her. According to Brown, he left his apartment at their request, and when he returned, both times all 3 were gone. According to a prosecution witness, a cleaner mopping upstairs at the time Gua went missing heard a woman's scream coming from Brown's apartment. Brian Altman, for the prosecution, said,
"It sounded as if someone was hurting this woman, and the sound continued for 2 to 3 minutes.
On October 6, 2008, Brown was convicted of the murders of Xiaomei Gua and Bonnie Barrett, and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years. The bodies of both women were never recovered. Police believe that Brown was at the beginning of a spree that was cut short by his capture. While he was widely labeled as a Jack the Ripper copycat, it appears Brown may not have had a distinct desire to specifically emulate the Ripper killings. However, Brown did tell an acquaintance.
Weeks earlier, Brown had told a family member he was going to be famous.
An argument he had with his estranged partner in June may give an indication that he sought notoriety. In that argument ended with him saying that she would hear about him in the future, that she may be hounded by the media. Given that he went on to kill 2 women in such a short period of time, it seems that notoriety may well be an aspect of his motivation.
According to Detective Mark Cundia,
If he kept killing prostitutes from the Whitechapel area, then that link with Jack the Ripper would be made.
he added that,
If this was a spree, it seems likely that we stopped him at number 2.
As for the original Jack the Ripper case, the only known evidence from the original case was a shawl believed to have belonged to one of the Ripper's victims. This item, which has been questioned by many, was DNA tested with modern technology by 2 British researchers who published their results in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. The findings from their results have led them to believe that the phantom serial killer could have been the 23-year-old barber, Aaron Kosminski, who was one of the first suspects during the initial Jack the Ripper investigation in the late 1800s. According to Science magazine, the study also includes an examination of the killer's appearance, which proposed the infamous murderer had brown hair and brown eyes, which matches the only reliable witness statement. However, the study's discoveries may not convince other Ripper experts who claim that the shawl may have been contaminated over the years. Others who have been critical of this specific Kosminski theory say there's no evidence that the shawl was ever at the actual crime scene. This is not the first test done to try and identify the infamous Jack the Ripper. Crime author Patricia Cornwell asked other scientists to examine DNA taken from the letters supposedly sent by the serial killer to authorities. Many scholars do not believe those letters are authentic. However, results that came out of Cornwell's request led her to believe that a painter named Walter Sickert may have been the Victorian slayer. Furthermore, another genetic analysis of the letters suggested that the murderer could have been a woman, which could support an existing theory, including that of Mary Piercy. It's also been said that Thomas Neil Cream, also known as the Lambeth Poisoner, was known to murder sex workers by offering them strychnine-laced drinks. Allegedly, at his execution, he was said to have cried out while he was being hung, "I am Jack the Ripper!" While interesting, this tale is highly unlikely, because at the time of the Ripper murders, Cream was in the United States. The one thing we can say for certain, at least for now, is that the true identity of the original Jack the Ripper still remains unknown.